Good morning. Welcome back to Passionate World Radio Network. Distinguish yourself from the ordinary. And this morning, on Lillian's interview, Lillian Caldwell will be interviewing an author from the International Miami Book Festival that runs from November 19th through the 20th. Amor, Towls wrote a book called A Gentleman in Moscow, or Rules of Civility. So, good morning, Amor. How are you today?
Great, thank you. How are you?
I am terrific. I want you to know I read your book, and it reminded me of No Exit by Sartre.
Yeah, I guess I can see that.
And it's not a criticism that you're a bad person here. I like the idea that you played with one person in a hotel, and he was exiled to that hotel.
Yes.
Never to leave.
Yeah, I mean, for your listeners, just to sort of catch them up to where you and I are, A Gentleman in Moscow sort of has an odd premise in that it opens at a tribunal in the Kremlin in 1922 where a 30-year-old aristocrat is being interviewed, and in the course of this interview it becomes clear that he wrote a poem as a young man that was very popular with the revolutionary generation. But on the other hand, he's an unrepentant aristocrat. So it's something of a compromise. They tell him that he can go back to the Metropole Hotel where he's been staying, and if he ever comes out again, he will be shot. And with the snap of a gavel, he's marched out of the Kremlin, across Red Square, through the doors of the historic hotel, where he then spends the next 32 years. And that's where, I ask you to spend 32 years with him. So as you say, it does have sort of a no-exit kind of element. It certainly has a different feel, a different conclusion than Sartre's work. But it's probably not really unique in the realm of narrative by any means to trap a protagonist in a small space and then trap the reader there with him. I mean, in a way, Moby Dick is set up in that fashion, right?
Absolutely.
Melville, we introduced this to Ishmael, and within 100 pages, we walk onto the Pequod with him, and that's where we stay for the remainder of the book. And I think that for many writers, we use different kinds of techniques to raise the stakes for ourselves, which might compel us out of our comfort zone to invent, into a realm of invention. And trapping our protagonist in a small space is one way to do that. Melville has to figure out ingenious ways to bring the world to the boat, so that we don't become claustrophobic on the ship, so that we see a greater sense of humanity, despite the fact that we are sort of with this small group on a voyage. And certainly this book is grappling with a similar kind of challenge, with a similar kind of goal. Although I certainly wouldn't compare myself to Melville; he's a great hero of mine.
Well, I'm glad I made the right allegory. But I do. This gentleman, he makes his life there, and he sees and observes, and he connects, and he reconnects, and he has a flexibility, not only with his body, but with his mind. And we both know that a lot of people can be put into solitary confinement, where they have to spend the next 20 years in a hole in the ground or whatever. And some people do very well because they go inside and expand inward, while other people rely on their hard physical surroundings, and that's when they go crazy.
Yes, I think you're right. So between the two routes, you certainly, in this kind of circumstance, you want to bring as much imagination, curiosity, memory, and humanity as you can in order to persist and to persist richly.
And I think, too, you give him something that he feels that he needs to live by, his inner code. And I firmly believe that the strength of a person is determined how well they can live with just themselves and not a surrounding population around them. And if they can master themselves, then they can master anything that comes along.
Yeah, I think that's well put. And I think that there's sort of a related notion that I'm interested in. It's not the primary theme of the book, but it's an important one, is that I think that we as Americans have a relatively narrow view of Russia in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, in that we think of those decades as being characterized by breadlines and shortages, by political and artistic oppression, by the fear of arrest and the risk of execution. And certainly all of these things were very significant attributes of Russian life during the Stalinist era. But we were kind of raised to think of that was the whole picture. It was almost like an ideological viewpoint during the Cold War that Americans were supposed to imagine that that's the only thing that happened in Russia. Everybody was miserable. Everybody was at risk at all times. But the reality was that for the vast majority of Russians during those decades, they continued to fall in love, to get married, to have children, to want the best for their children, to interact with art, to appreciate music, to appreciate literature. And so there was a richness to life even for those in Russia and under those circumstances. And this book is to some degree an exploration of how does an individual where there's a black cloud and that's passing over the nation, over the era, continue to find relationships that matter, to find means and cause for joy, however small, to find purpose. Because I do think that the human species has sort of a will to joy, and even in these challenging times, through an array of means, we will find some means of connection and celebration and optimism, even in our darkest hour. And you're right that the strongest of us will do that with greater ease. But I think that all people will try to persist as best they can.
And I think too, people, and I know most Americans, not all, they all like to be able to go to one place, one tourist attraction, one cabin in the woods, one house by the sea, wherever it is, as a refuge, to seal themselves off from the brittleness of reality and to oppose themselves in somebody else's reality, even if it's for just several minutes, hours, whatever. And that if in choosing that they can make their life better or somebody else's life better, that they will do it. I mean, we have shown that time and time again when people have been struck by hurricanes or tornadoes or floods or fire, that we as a nation tend to pull together to set everything right. And the same thing happens within the walls of this hotel.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way, an interesting way of putting it. And I guess sort of a related notion to the front end of your comment is certainly that Walden is another version of a tale. I mean, obviously it's nonfiction, but a tale in which the individual is pursuing the infinite, not by traveling the world, but by retreating into a cabin, in this case, in the woods, removed from society. And I think that for Thoreau, clearly there's certain advantages to that isolation. That is, in fact, from his point of view, where we can access eternity most effectively. Whereas out in the daily world, our engagement with our careers, with social circles, with the envy of our neighbors, with the news cycle, these things become all compelling and distracting, and they interfere to some degree with that other type of engagement. And so, you have this irony that yes, the Count within the confines of the hotel has the opportunity to pursue that other avenue. He is not in the crosshairs of the daily engagement of the outside world, and that he has some relief from that. The book deals with both of those worlds, both the world that he creates for himself within the hotel through the relationships, through the way that he spends his time, through his memories, through his engagement with literature. But on the other hand, you see what's happening in Russia through those decades, partly by who is coming and going through the doors of the hotel, bringing the reality of the present times with them and through the experiences that they're having out in the street, as it were.
And I think it's important to present a book like this. It reminds me of another book I read about 10 years ago. I do not remember the title, but it's somebody on a boat, and as they're going downstream, they have the scenery on both sides passing by. And the scenery changes very little, and then sometimes it changes a lot, but it's the people who make the scenery either interesting and makes the person on the boat really curious what's going on, and so he fills in everything what's going on. But as he's traveling, he's the only person who's really moving, and everybody else is frozen within that frame.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's something else I got from the book, that it's important, I think, for people to actually still themselves, to focus on what is truly, really important. And in the book, ladies and gentlemen, you will find that the protagonist does just that. He stills himself within the hotel and realizes who he is, why he's there. He doesn't lie to himself. That's the one thing I like about him as a character. He never lies to himself.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I think he is, hopefully, he's received by readers as a person of integrity, and I think that one of the interesting aspects, one of the interesting things to keep in mind when you're reading about this character or reading his thought process, the way he lives, is that he was raised as a gentleman. He was born in 1890, raised as in the aristocracy in Russia, and trained in, as it were, the literature of the nobility, the high culture of Russia, the etiquette of gentlemen. And I think for we as Americans today, we often think of manners as sort of this nice sort of surface frosting on our behaviors. That's really sort of this almost shallow type of pleasant nicety that we are supposed to pursue. But for the 19th century nobility, the people raised in high culture of that time, they viewed manners in a much more intricate fashion, dating back to the age of Enlightenment thinkers and the Stoics. Long before that, they thought of manners as the outward expression of an inward struggle. The inward struggle was mastery over the seven sins. We have the impulse to be greedy, to be impatient, to be angry, to be lustful. We are all born with those impulses, and the thinkers from the Enlightenment, the Stoics, believed that a human being could master those weaknesses, and manners were a part of the means of mastery. You master them through reflection, but also you use manners to slow yourself down before you let the impulse run wild. Before you said that angry thing, before you said that crass remark, before you made that lustful gesture, the manners would stop that. And ideally, in that interim, while you were being polite, you internally were wrestling that impulse to bay, so that the better aspect, your better instinct, could express itself outwardly. And the Count certainly comes from this tradition, where his behavior is gentlemanly, but it's clearly tied to a sense of moral action, as opposed to simply a surface behavior.
And he holds true to it, to the two girls that he raises, to the young men he comes in contact with, all the way towards the end where he becomes part of the hotel and starts working within the hotel, and something that he does very well, which is his knowledge of wines and liqueurs, and he's able to help the people who have displaced the nobility. They're now political nobility, and they do not know what he has been taught. Therefore, he's able to provide to them what they feel they should know, but will never know.
That's right. It's sort of that one of the ironies, as you say, relatively early in the book, the Count, without a sense of purpose, decides to get a job, as it were, within the bounds of the hotel. And it's not a big spoiler, but he becomes a waiter. And the irony is that one who was raised in the nobility or the aristocracy of the 19th century is the perfect waiter. in the 20th century because they were raised with a knowledge of cuisine, of wine, of manners in foreign languages. So that you have the highest person in a way is perfectly suited to fulfill this role that we think of as relatively low in the social spectrum, but yet it can be a central person in social interaction, the waiter.
But if you look at the characters that you bring in from the party, who have reached the zenith of their life, they're still low-born. They don't come from the same class. So I find it's a certain irony.
Yes.
And I enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I said, oh, boy, this guy knows what he's doing. Okay, This is great. I love it. More. And I don't know if too many people who would pick up on it. I picked up on it. I've not been to Russia, but my father certainly did. He had a worldwide reputation of being an excellent negotiator, and the Russians would not have anybody else come in to negotiate for their natural gas fields in Siberia.
Wow.
They demanded that Mr. Caldwell come and negotiate or all bets are off. So my father spent 9 months in Siberia, and it was fascinating when he called home to get some other work done, because you would always hear this third heavy breathing on the other end, and it was really kind of fascinating what he said and stuff. But he had been brought up with a certain type of manners, as this gentleman has, and they just insisted it was either he was there or nothing was to be done. And we're not talking about a CEO here, folks, or a president. We're talking about a man who was bright, and he had his degrees, and he knew his stuff, and he was really excellent at what he did. And the Russians at that time, who were politically in power, demanded. This was during the late 60s.
Gotcha.
So I enjoyed your irony.
Thank you.
So, Amor, please tell everybody where they can find you at the International Book Festival, what day you'll be appearing, if you're on any panels, where they can find you on the World Wide Web.
Yes, at amortowls.com, there's an events. Well, first of all, one of the things that's interesting there for those who read the book and get intrigued by it, I have a chronological list of firsthand accounts from famous people, in many cases Americans, of life inside the actual Metropole Hotel in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, which sort of serve as kind of a nice backdrop to the novel. But yes, there's an events page there, and it details the timing of the event at the Miami Book Fair. I will be with the great Maria Semple, of Giorgio Bernadette fame, because her new book is out, and we will be speaking together, I believe, on Sunday morning around 10.
Terrific. I'll be down there, too.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. If you want to hear this all over again, this interview with Mr. Towls, you can hear it at PassionateWorldRadioNetwork.com, Facebook.com/PWR Network LLC, Twitter.com/CAULDWELL, and GooglePlus.com/PWR Network LLC. Thank you all very much for listening. The book, again, is A Gentleman in Moscow, Amor, A-M-O-R, Towls, T-O-W-L-E-S. Thank you all very much for listening, and remember, please keep listening. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lillian.
You're welcome.